So greetings, hello. It's Dr Daffern here, and it's Easter Sunday in the Christian calendar, so I'm celebrating by sharing again my Sunday broadcast. This time, hopefully infused by my philosophical studies during this period. I'm speaking as always as a philosopher and theologian, expert in transpersonal history. I will be touching on the politics of Brexit but also other things. The tragic bombing in Sri Lanka overnight when churches were blown up and over 100 people have been killed. I mean, it's completely sad and tragic in Colombo. And the fire in Notre Dame as well, which happened since my last broadcast. So the world is going through quite a lot of crises at the moment. What comfort can we draw? What insights can we draw on from philosophy? As coordinator of Philosophers of Peace, I run an institute dealing with peace and global philosophy. I want to share just some thoughts that might give some succour to some of the people that are confused by the tragic events that seem to be going on. And I'm going to try and join up some dots philosophically and metaphysically. Okay, let me start with my condolences to the Christians in Sri Lanka who've suffered a terrible attack. It's completely monstrous that people should be killed in churches during Easter Sunday, their most holy day of the year in some respects. It's tragic that people should be killed in any religious sanctuary, as they were shot in a mosque in New Zealand recently by a white racist right-wing kind of fanatic, apparently. So against all such attacks, I speak out very, very strongly. I think these sacred sites should be completely off limits to violence. I mean, I'm completely against violence of any kind. I'm a person of non-violence, but to do assaults in these kind of places is tragic. Now, from an Islamic perspective, as a Sufi scholar and historian of Islamic philosophy, and I taught at the Muslim college, if it was Muslims who planted those bombs in those churches, they're completely going against the Quran. They're going against Islam. They're not Muslims at all. Which is why one wonders, actually, who is responsible for these kind of atrocities done? Is it actually Muslims, or is it sort of fake Muslims that are terrorist cells dressed up by some international intelligence agency that James Bond can't penetrate, and which is making it look as if it's Muslims doing it, in order to whip up hatred against Islam? We don't know, do we? We're in the dark, and this is part of the problem of the contemporary world. We're stuck within so many layers of lies that to find truth, which is my job as a philosopher and historian, is very difficult these days. I suspend judgment. My first duty is to suspend judgment on who did these attacks. But one thing I can absolutely say in absolute truth is they're not true Muslims. Now, if the people that did this are some kind of Islamist cell of terrorists who think they're Muslims, which is possible, then they've been completely miseducated, falsely educated. I used to teach at the Muslim college in London with Dr Zaki Badawi, one of Britain's greatest Islamic scholars. He was a great man. I loved him dearly. He was a wise man. We had long conversations. He was a friend of Prince Charles as well, who also is an appreciator of Islamic philosophy and has written about it in some of Charles's own books. And Charles and he discussed setting up a sort of philosophy circle to discuss Islamic and Christian reconciliation, and I've been involved in the fringes of that work, and that's why I'm doing my commentary on the Quran and also on the Gospels and St. Paul and the writings of the New Testament, because I can see the interconnected symmetry of thought underlying these sacred texts. I maintain that if every Muslim imam training in a school or seminary or university anywhere in the world were also required to study other sacred texts like the New Testament, like the Talmud, like other holy texts, the Vedas, the Zoroastrian scriptures. And if all priests training as Christian priests in every seminary around the planet were required to also study other sacred texts like the Quran, like the Talmud, like other books, and the same for all the other training academies, then at a blow, the religious intelligentsia of the planet would come out 100% for peace. I mean, I come from where I'm coming from because I have studied all these things over many years, 30, 40 years, during an intense period of research in Canada in the late 1970s after my philosophy studies at Bristol University. I took it upon myself to study these texts in great, great detail, the Quran, the Bible, the Vedas, the Gathas, etc., and realised, that at the level of actual scholarship, there is a common core message to them all. And really, my whole life has since then just been a series of attempts to demonstrate what I found as a young student and to share it because it's such extraordinary, amazing good news. There is no need for these religious wars. They are old hat. They are pre-scientific in their thinking, these people. Whether they're doing this in the name of some kind of fanatical right-wing Christian neo-Templarism, the whites rule the planet kind of ideology, like, the bonkers guy in New Zealand and his cronies in Norway and so on, or whether they're doing it in sort of some form of fundamentalist Islamic, Allah's the best, we're going to revenge against the whites and blow up their churches. The poor people in Sri Lanka, I mean, they're amazing people. I've known Sri Lankan Christians, I've known Catholic Christians from Sri Lanka. Profoundly amazing, deep people, and this is a tragedy. I also have a good friend who runs an interfaith project in Sri Lanka, who I've met through my non-violence work, and who's coordinator of my institute in Sri Lanka, Muzammil Kadat, who is a Muslim scholar and interfaith expert. He must be deeply, deeply upset on this day. So I send my greetings to him, and let's find out who did this. Let's suspend judgment, and then. But one thing I can absolutely say this is caused by ignorance. Whoever did this is simply ignorant in the technical sense of ignoring the truth. And our response, as whether we're imams or scholars or rabbis or priests or whatever, has to be, as ever, to educate, to put out the facts of love, to put out the facts, the truth, or the truths in the multiple religious world we live in. I mean, I coordinate the Commonwealth Interfaith Network, and Sri Lanka is a Commonwealth country. Zamil is coordinator for that in Sri Lanka. This is a blow against everything the Commonwealth stands for, which is a commonwealth of wisdom. It's not just, trading agreements between Commonwealth countries and all that, although that's important too. It's the Commonwealth we all share in our respect and tolerance for each other's views. And that's what Prince Charles stands for as well. I have met him. He knows his duty one day as king is to stand for that universal wisdom, which Christianity, of course, at its best, also stands for. That's why the church is so precious. And the church in England, which I've been, raised in and followed theologically, stands for that universalizing wisdom that is at the heart of Christianity, which we celebrate today on Easter Sunday. And my greetings go to all Christians in the world who have studied and realised that violence is not the way, who are not fanatics, who realise that we have to find a way to a peaceful world. That is the primary duty laid on us, I think, as Christians, and as all faiths, Buddhist, Druid, whatever. I mean, I have studied them all and taken initiations in them all, or most of them. So that is the first thing I want to say, is my utter abhorrence of this violent act in Sri Lanka, my commiseration to the families and all the people involved, and the people who did this must be found and punished, punished by education. My commentaries on the Quran, if they turn out to be Muslims, should, I think, be compulsory listening in prisons where Muslims have committed terrorist actions. I've written to the head of the Muslim chaplaincy in Her Majesty's Prison Service in the UK and suggested my commentaries on the Quran be adopted as a standard reading text for Islamic prisoners accused of violence, because they are an antidote to it. What I've tried to do in my commentary on the Quran, which is ongoing, is to show that Islam is not a religion of violence at all. It's a religion in which self-defense is permissible, which is a kind of common sense position. You know, if I'm attacked by a mad axeman suddenly bursting into this room, I will defend myself. You know, I have a duty and a right to. But I'm not going to go and do that to anyone else. And if they don't do it to me, then we can live in peace. I want to share a verse from the Quran, which I've been commenting on only yesterday, as it happens, which to me is one of the most beautiful verses in the entire Quran. I'd love to see this written out in beautiful calligraphy and on the wall of every single mosque, church, synagogue, temple, gurdwara in the world. If that was so, I think, and if people really understood what it meant, there would be an end to all these wars, and Muslims wouldn't be committing acts of violence, nor would Christians or Jews or anyone else. This is the blueprint for the common universality of wisdom traditions, which is what I stand for, and which Sufism, you know, and all the other beautiful Gnostic traditions uphold specifically. This is a verse from Surah 2, which is called the Cow, and it's a later surah from the Medina period of Muhammad's life. I'm giving the historical context when I'm doing my commentaries. And you can listen to my full commentary on the Quran on my Green University website, Global Green University. You know, it's an awful lot of work. It's taken hundreds of hours of my time. But I'm investing this for the future. I hope students will be reading this, you know, hundreds of years from now, because it's the blueprint for peace, really. So this is this wonderful verse, Surah 2, verse 136. Say, ye, we believe in God and the revelation given to us, and to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, and that given to Moses and Jesus, and that given to all prophets from their Lord. We make no difference between one and another of them, and we bow to God. I mean, this is a blueprint for interfaith harmony and peace. What Muhammad is saying in this surah is that he's in Medina, he's having conversations with the Jewish tribes that are living there, and also some Christians, who are saying, look, you know, convert to us, become Christian or become Jewish. And this wonderful surah of the Cow, which is very interesting and complex, keeps saying the Islamic position, which is, no, what we're going to try and do is go back to the core primordial revelation from which you come. So before there were Jews, before there were Christians, what was that faith? Well, that faith was that of Abraham, is what Muhammad has worked out in his cultural milieu, in which his mind has been absorbing influences from traditional Arabic pagan sources, also Manichaean sources from Hira, which is a town in southern Iraq he almost certainly visited, which was full of Manichaean scholars. It was on the trade route to Zoroastrian Iran. He would have met Zoroastrians. We know Salman the Farsi was a Zoroastrian originally, just one of many that were around that area. And he would have met different types of Christians. And his own wife, Khadija, was a kind of Gnostic Christian, Universalist Gnostic type, who obviously influenced him as well a great deal. And her cousin, Waraka, was also a Gnostic universalizing Christian, esotericist, you know, of this same kind of let's go for the universal common truth between all faiths, please, school, which is you know what we should all be doing, isn't it? And in an earlier part of this surah, which I commented on yesterday, Muhammad says, or the Quran says through Muhammad, because my understanding is that Muhammad is receiving this insight, revelatory download, if you want, a kind of channeling from the highest reaches of his transpersonal consciousness, which you can say comes from an angelic source, which comes from a higher source, but it's filtered down through his own consciousness and his own language and his own cerebral cortex, and it comes out in Arabic speech, which then we translate into other languages like English. So I think the duty of the commentator, what I'm trying to do, is to trace all the levels of that download as much as possible to see what's the transpersonal source of it, where it comes from, and try and translate that direct, as it were, go back to the source, try and see if I can tune in with my, psychic faculties or seership or whatever I have as a mere scholar. I can also develop those seership faculties as a druid to plug into that transpersonal source, and then try and download the thoughts that I think Muhammad put into Arabic in his way, or I need to retranslate them into a way that the 21st century cosmopolitan, universalist, post-enlightenment world culture can make sense of. Because the fact is, Muhammad was limited in his education. He had no higher education. He was possibly semi-literate or illiterate. And there are many, many religions he didn't know about. He'd never heard of Taoism or Hinduism or Buddhism. He'd never heard of Druidry or Greek paganism or Rome. He'd never heard of Plato and Aristotle or the Socratics or American Indian religion. No, didn't even know there was an America. Didn't know about the geography and the full size of the world, let alone the universe, which we now know is pretty vast with billions and billions of galaxies. He had no clue about all this. Now that doesn't invalidate the core message and insights of the Quran, in my opinion, but it does mean we have to reframe them into we have to realise the limitations of the packaging that Muhammad's mind gave these downloads, and then we have to retranslate them into a cosmic kind of awareness that now is available on the planet. So that's what I'm doing in my commentaries, and it's it's a challenging but immensely rewarding task. And as for whether it's heretical, of course it's it would be only heretical to people that I would call heretics, i.e. people of small minds, people of small intelligence, who think they have a monopoly on this sacred book and its interpretation. Those, Muhammad, bless him, would never agree that that is the case. I mean, every sage or prophet that gives out teachings, there's going to be a variety of people in the room, just as when Jesus was teaching, some of which get it, some of which don't, some of which try and stone him, some of which eventually crucify him. Same with Muhammad. Some people listened to him and thought he was stark raving mad. Others kind of got it and said, when can I join? I want to be a Muslim. Others got it at a deeper philosophical level. It's the same with Buddha. When he taught and held up a flower, some people just thought he'd gone bonkers. What's this, flower sermon? One guy in the audience got enlightened, and that fully, truly, totally enlightened, and that was the beginning of the Zen transmission, right? So of course there's variation in the way people will perceive and appreciate the Quran. And I have no claim to absolute, priority. Read my commentary as one commentary among many. Make your own. It's a book for the universal wisdom of humanity, just as the Bible is, the Talmud, the Zoroastrian Gathas, the Buddhist scriptures. They're all ours. We all own these things. It was cosmic mind that made them all. And as Hegel pointed out, bless him, a great philosopher in the 19th century, as we plug into cosmic mind and spirit, we can then increase the sophistication of our commentary and understanding of all this legacy. So that's how we get peace, right? Now, obviously, whoever planted these bombs in Colombo and Sri Lanka had never, just has been denied access to that way of thinking, and that it's not only permissible. What I'm talking about is actually meta-orthodoxy, because what I'm saying is authentic Islam. This is conformed by the greatest of the Islamic philosophers who I've studied over the years, and the greatest Islamic saints and Sufis and inspired commentators. I'm just simply following on their coattails here. And I've been to Cordoba. I've sat at the feet of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Arabi and I've been to Jerusalem and walked around the old Islamic quarter, and I've been to Fez, and I'm just a student of the wisdom that the Quran embodies. And this verse to me sums the whole thing up. This is the Quran in one verse, right? So what God is saying through Muhammad is saying, look, what you stand for is you believe in God, i.e. some kind of ultimate reality which judges and creates and sustains this universe. The Quran doesn't have a sophisticated theology. Muhammad had never studied advanced theology in a Christian academy. He didn't understand the Trinity. He'd never been to India, didn't understand the Hindu Trinity, didn't come to the Celtic world, didn't understand the Druid Trinity. No, he's very, there's one God, there's one ultimate source, the monad. And, he's right. All the sophisticated numbers of the world systems come from one. Without unity, there can be no progress in further numbering. So every number ultimately cancels back to one. And that's what he's pointing out, which is, divine mathematics. If you study Pythagoras, his tetractys, the 10 numbers, come from the monad, the one. You have the dyad, comes from that, the 2, the triad, the 3, and the quator, the 4. They make 4 rows of dots, which make an equilateral triangle that sum up as 10. We have 10 fingers, This is the Pythagorean mystery. That was adapted and adopted and used by the Jewish Kabbalah in its Sephirot system of 10 Sephiroth. All that is in existence comes from these 10 points. Now, whether Pythagoras and the Kabbalah received it from the same source, I suspect that's the case, because Pythagoras was part Phoenician, he was part Semitic. He'd studied in Babylon, he'd studied in Phoenicia, he studied wherever he could, Egypt. He was a polymath, like Posidonius, the great Stoic philosopher I'm going to be talking about shortly. And he came across, he said, look, that's how you sum up everything, 10 dots. It's brilliant. And that's what the Kabbalah does, 10 Sephiroth, that's it. Now, of course, Muhammad didn't know all this, but he intuited it. He was an inspired, intuitive sage, as Thomas Carlyle and Goethe recognised when they appreciated Muhammad's contribution to world civilization. And I know it's customary and people are fond of being very anti-Muslim, but we shouldn't be. What Muhammad did was incredible. Goethe knew that. Thomas Carlyle knew that. Many great Orientalists that I've studied know that. But what we can be against is an oversimplistic and narrow interpretation of Islam. The truth of Islam is beautiful. It can contribute to world civilization as it has. It brought us science, mathematics, Arabic numbering, metaphysics, translations of Aristotle into Arabic. We would have lost Aristotle without Muslim philosophers. And there'd be no universities in the West. There'd be no degrees, no higher degrees. Aquinas and people, they would never have existed. We'd still not be eating with forks and having no oranges and doing maths in very complicated Roman numbers. I mean, come on, give us a break. We owe a lot to these Muslim geniuses. But that's not the types that are doing the bombings, you see. What I think the West has done, which is so wrong, is by its geopolitical alliance with Islamic fundamentalism, particularly Wahhabite, simplistic sort of, monotheology, which is not true Islam, it's actually a heresy. What Western geopolitical strategists have done is that by allying with these most fundamentalist forces, using them illegally to subvert the Soviet Union, as it then was, and to destroy its presence in Afghanistan, and using it as a tool, teaching them how to do explosions and bombings and to fight guerrilla wars, then that was turned back on everybody, because if you teach, people of this sort to do that kind of evil stuff, then they just go on doing it. They're like, you don't teach adolescent kids how to fire Kalashnikovs. It's, I know as a teacher, you don't allow live guns with firearms into the classroom. I mean, you get sacked if you're a teacher. Well, our intelligence services thought this was clever. They should be sacked, And ultimately it leads to 9/11. I'm also celebrating on this day, Easter Sunday, the fact that yesterday, Easter Saturday, I published volume 2 of my historical study of the events of 9/11, what caused it and the consequences. The cause is ignorance, just the same as with the Colombo bombings. My question as a historian is what kind of ignorance, whose ignorance, for what purpose, because it's ignorance, but it's a moral ignorance. It required quite a lot of technical savvy to pre-wire the buildings. And I'm starting from the perspective that David Ray Griffin and Architects and Engineers for Truth have come to, which is that the evidence is 100% overwhelming that the official legend, story, myth, conspiracy theory of the Bush regime, which is 19 Al-Qaeda operatives did all of this, hijacked 4 planes and brought down the Twin Towers, Building 7, smashed into the Pentagon, we're going to get the White House, and that's all. It was the 19. And they were backed up by Osama bin Laden in a cave in Afghanistan. That's the official story. And it's just so full of holes, it's like a grater. You can blow wind through it. It's just simply not true, and I've done my research over a considerable length of time. I've devoted as a scholar to this period of research, and the fruits of that, I've spent 2 years writing it up since April 2017. We're now April 2019, I published it yesterday. Volume 2, it shows the reactions of world leaders and countries around the world to the events of 9/11. Because the catastrophic misinterpretation of 9/11, which was published by the media and the hijacked public space that the American media dominates, is that, well, that was Saddam Hussein's fault, let's go get him. Cheney and Rumsfeld and co were already on the second day, or on the evening of 9/11, that very evening, having strategy meetings, how we can attack Iraq as a result of this. It was a conscious decision, which is illegal under international law, immoral under ethical law, and ignorant under any kind of, intelligence rating of diplomatic and foreign policy moves. So it's just with incalculable consequences, which I've explored in volume 2, because the destruction of Iraqi civilization, which was a very sophisticated form of Islam, whatever you think of Saddam Hussein and co, his Ba'ath tradition in Iraq was a highly intellectually sophisticated form of Islam. There was freedom of speech, as long as you didn't criticize him. There was freedom of religion, people could have different faiths, there were Baha'is, there were Christians. His prime minister was a Christian. Iraq was a model of interfaith harmony, actually, in the Middle East, in some respects. And so what happened, anyway, is of grave consequence, and that led to the further advance of Islamic oversimplificated extremism, which then crops up in Syria, in the Syrian jihadist movement, which again the West seems to back and support. So I'm exposing all this in my book on 9/11. I'm not just looking at the events of 9/11, I'm looking at the consequences. And anyone that's interested in contemporary history that we've been living through, I think should read my book. It's 2 volumes, it's 800 pages, it's taken me 2 years to write up and 10 years to research. And I think the whole thing arises from a complete failure to understand the real meaning of what we're supposed to be doing on this planet, whether we're Muslims, Jews, Christians, or any other faith. So that's why now I'm devoting my intellectual effort to commentaries on these sacred texts, because I think the root problem is we've come unstuck from that authentic faith that is talked about in this wonderful verse. We believe in God, okay, great ultimate, Buddha nature, doesn't matter what you call it, Allah, and the revelations given to us, and to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes. Well, this is extremely generous. What the Quran is saying through Muhammad here is affirming that these revelations are coming from a divine source, and that it's the same source as Abraham received his revelation from. Now, Abraham was a very important figure, obviously, in Islam and in Mecca and in the mindset of Muhammad and his circle. And it is to this day among Muslims and also Jews and Christians. Abraham, I think, was a real historical figure. There's a lot of evidence for that. Who would have lived, people say, round about 1750 BC. He was probably an Aramean. He came from he travelled, he was in Haran, he was in Egypt, he was in Palestine, Canaanite territory. And he was a wandering Aramean, he's sometimes called. Now, what's important about Abraham is he lived at the time when the alphabet was being first invented. And that's why his stories and his oral traditions come into the Bible and later into the Quran. Because he happened to be at the epicenter of the invention of the alphabet, which was the huge, like the internet of its day. It was a revolutionary tool for encoding information and disseminating it. But the irony here is that Abraham's faith, which was the faith in the ultimate unity behind all existence, he was going for that monad that Pythagoras talked about. He was coming from the same source as Pythagoras, and the Qabalah received that wisdom transmission. And according to the Qabalah, which is the esoteric Jewish wisdom tradition and the Christian, is Abraham also had a Kabbalistic relationship to God. There's the oral transmission from Abraham, which comes down, as well as the written. The written comes down through the book of Genesis and other holy texts. But the oral transmission is the source of the Qabalah itself. And, that's an oral transmission, which I've been, blessed. I've been taught by different Kabbalist teachers over the years. I've dipped into that profound stream. And, I also observed that this weekend is also the Jewish Passover. It's Pesach on Friday, and it lasts for 7 or 8 days. And that commemorates the Moses experience, when Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, back to their homeland ultimately. And that symbolises in the Kabbalah the duty of us humans to go back to God, to go back to our source. The whole point of that. Egypt's lovely. We all love Egypt. We should all spend time in Egypt. That stands for sensuality, sexuality, beauty, comfort, an easy life. Although, of course, the Jews hadn't. They'd been worked to the bone. They were not in the upper class of Egyptian society. But if you were an upper class Egyptian, you had a great life. And they were perfecting all manner of comforts and luxuries. And you have to leave all that. You have to go up the mountain in the desert to find the encounter with God. Now that is a journey each one of us has to make on this planet. We're born into a body. Our parents, if we're lucky, are nice to us, give us a nice comfy bed to sleep in. We don't freeze to death. We have our mother's love to look after us, and our fathers and so on, and we have a nice, comfortable life. But at a certain point, one realises that comfort and ease and luxury and all that are not the only thing in life. Well, what's the meaning of this life? The adolescent normally says. And it hits different people at different times. You say, well, what is this life about? Why am I here? And that's the time when you go into the desert. You have to go and have that inner journey. In the shamanic tradition, it's the place where you go and search for your lost name.